Morning, Jason. Thanks so much for joining us.
Morning, Lauren. How are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. I wanted to talk today about the Charter for Change that the trade union group within the Workers' Party has developed, and sort of what conditions have developed that have facilitated this sort of program and need for this program. I don't know whether you want to start by talking us through sort of a brief history of the trade union movement and what's led to the creation of this program for change.
Yeah, okay. Well, it'd be very difficult to do a full history of trade unionism in an interview, but as potted a version as I can do, trade unionism as a phenomenon began at the end of the 18th century with the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
And what happened in the Industrial Revolution was what Marxists call proletarianisation. So you had people brought to places of social production, so factories, mines, mills, and so on. And of course, one of the drawbacks for the ruling classes when they did that, although it had a lot of advantages for them, was it brought people doing similar work to the same place at the same time. And so what people could do, if they had any issues, big or small issues with their employer, they could speak to each other in their place of work to determine what it is they could do about it. And we go on from that, we look at things like the Merthyr Rising, we look at things like the Tolpuddle Martyrs, which is a group of farmers who protested against their landowner cutting their wages. They swore an oath under a tree in Tolpuddle in Dorset. And for their trouble, they were tried under an Act of Parliament that had never been used before then, and then were transported to Australia. And that started a movement in this country to give them all full pardons and return them to England. So that's where the earliest roots of trade unionism lie. Now, trade unionism has gone through a number of stages since then. Towards the end of the 19th century, we saw the establishment of what we recognise now as modern trade unions. In a lot of cases, they were brought about by mergers of what were called craft unions. And craft unions were unions of people who did extremely specialised work. So, for instance, boat builders, tailors, carpenters, things like that. So those workers had leverage with their employers because they had a skill that was very difficult to replace.
Yeah.
When they become more formalised into what we would recognise, as I said, as modern trade unions, one of the slight disadvantages to that was because they had craft union background, they had craft union mentality. So these were privileged workers. These were workers who had skills and workers who were often quite well rewarded, if not as well rewarded as they would have liked. But of course, that attitude then pervaded into the 20th century, where you had this section of workers who had a great deal of skill, were quite well remunerated, and then there was another part of them that didn't have that. And the trade unions often, especially at the beginning of the 20th century, tried to avoid organising working class people who were unskilled. Okay, as you go through the 20th century, I suppose the obvious, well, there were two events I think that are worthy of note. The first, obviously, the end of the Second World War. The end of the Second World War, Britain faced a unique set of circumstances in that you had a working class that had organised to fight fascism in Europe. But you also had a country that was economically on its knees and architecturally on its knees, if you look at cities like Coventry and places like that. But you also had an example of another way, and that other way was the Soviet Union. And so workers came back from the Second World War demanding much better than what their fathers had to experience after the end of the First World War, where David Lloyd George promised them homes fit for heroes and gave them abject poverty. So you had a 20-year period between 1945 and 1965 where there was what was called a post-war consensus. So the ruling class and the working class worked together in as probably as amicable a situation as they've ever had to rebuild the nation, rebuild the economy. But then, of course, the rate of profit absolutely was destroyed in about 1965, and that set about the ruling class clawing back all the things that they gave to the working class in the previous 20 years.
I guess the period we will kind of refer to as like neoliberalization. This is when, you know, things move towards more financialization of the industry, of the services sector, and you know, manufacturing and stuff was like decimated in Western
Yeah,
Europe.
absolutely. I mean, there are some in the trade union movement who make the argument about whether or not deindustrialization is an organic process through capitalism, or whether governments have any power. I think the answer is somewhere in the middle. Yeah. I think it's a natural progression of capitalism to move manufacture abroad, because the rate of profit naturally declines. Yep. But there are governments that can intervene, and some choose not to. So it's somewhere in the middle, as I said. So the next event that, and it was a seismic event for the trade union movement, of course, was the miners' strike in 1984, 1985, a year-long dispute that was led by the president of the NUM, Arthur Scargill. There was fractures in the trade union movement then. Yeah. Anyone who's read the history of the miners' strike would know the EETPU, the Engineers, Electronics, Telecommunications and Plumbing Union, if I remember right. They held a vote and voted to oppose the strike. Yeah. And actually helped to undermine the strike by sending scab workers in to undermine the miners. The Labour Party abandoned the miners, and after a year out on strike, the miners were defeated. Now, the miners obviously said that they felt that they had some concessions, but I think it'd be fair to say after nearly 40 years of reflection that the miners were defeated. Yeah. And then what happened after then was a almost endless attack on workers by government. Yeah. So you had raft after raft of trade union legislation coming into effect that restricted the amount of people you could have on picket lines. It restricted the manner in which you could hold workplace ballots. It restricted all kinds of things. It even restricted general secretaries to 5-year terms before they had to be re-elected. And then when you got to 1997 with the election of the Blair government, Tony Blair was elected to power on the basis that he would not touch any of those anti-trade union laws. So what he did instead, in order to, in some way at least, appease the unions, he introduced a raft of other legislations, but they were all aimed at individuals. Yeah. They were not aimed at collective workers. Yeah. So it gave individual workers the right to have or to be accompanied at a disciplinary interview, for instance, whereas before they weren't. And all aimed at the individual, and all deliberate. It was all deliberate. It was all part of the Blairite plan to try and separate workers from trade unionism. Yeah. And we find ourselves now in a position where we have a trade union movement that's roughly half the size it was in 1979. It's about 6.5 million now. It was 13 million then. And while
the population's grown quite.
Well, that's it. I think the population in 1979 was 57 million.
Yeah, so like half of the whole population were in unions, and now it's
absolutely. Yeah. And now we find ourselves with 6.5 million organised workers in a workforce of about 30 million. Yeah. So the trade union footprint on the working class is very, very small. And when you look at the industries, the sectors that trade unions organise in, it is almost entirely the public sector, not the private sector. Yeah. So you're talking about the service industries. You're talking about things like the NHS, government, local government, and so. And yeah, absolutely. And so, whilst these people do vital work, they're what's called non-productive labour. They don't have their hands on the levers of economic power. Yeah. So they can't make capital. They're not producing commodities. They're not exactly. Yes, they don't create things that are sold. So whilst they are strong in number and quite strong in organisation, they don't have what if you like a vanguard set of workers like the miners were in the mid-80s.
They can't shut down production. They can't hurt the ruling class economically.
Exactly.
Really.
Exactly. And so you're left with a situation where you have workers organised in trade unions that do not have their hands on the levers of economic power, still have organisation, still very well motivated, still politically motivated, but are not able to win serious concessions from capital. They might be able to win concessions from their own employers, but as with all situations like that, as soon as you win the employer is trying to find ways to claw back what they've given you.
Yeah.
So that brings us to where we are now. So we've got a trade union movement that's had 2 years of COVID, 2 years of lockdowns, although it has to be said, a lot of the members the trade union movement organised didn't stop working. They were still working in some capacity or other. We find ourselves with rampant inflation. Yeah. We find ourselves with trade unions making agreements on pay rises and finding those pay rises go stale because inflation has overtaken them.
Yeah.
And we do have, and this is my view, we do have a number of trade unions that are pretty supine at the moment. They're not really doing anything.
Yeah.
Unite is a standout that seems to be quite active across the country in many industries. But apart from that, you do see a great deal of inactivity amongst trade unions in general.
In a time when, you know, workers should be out on the streets, you know, withholding their labor until they are paid adequately to keep up with the increase in cost of living. I mean, it is quite shocking to me that, you know, you look across the channel to the French and they're out on the streets. I mean, you know, they're always out on the streets riding, but, you know, fuel prices are at record levels, food, electricity, gas are all going through the roof, which means that, you know, in essence, workers are getting poorer by the day. And, you know, where is the union movement sort of leading calls for strikes and other kind of, you know, class struggle, really?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, if you take the TUC at best will organise a march, and we'll have a march in London, and then we'll all go to the pub afterwards, and we'll
it'll be on a weekend when, you know, everyone's on everyone's day of rest.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's pretty much the limit of what is prepared to do.
Yeah.
You know, we've got workers who are having to contend with, in most cases, modest pay rises if they get a pay rise at all, and inflation that, if you look at RPI, which is the level of inflation that a lot of trade unions look at in terms of pay rises, because it includes things like housing, it's 8.4 or 8.2% at the moment, 8.2%,
and
so
rising.
It's absolutely rampant, and the trade union movement, in my view, needs to do much more than it does at the moment, much more, including the TUC.
Do you think the weakness of the trade union movement is really a result of its ties with the Labour Party? I mean, I know that, you know, there are specific unions affiliated to the Labour Party, but the mentality of it is still one of social democracy, one of being tied to the ideology of the Labour Party, or is it just a lack of members? I mean, I guess it's not either or. It's these things go together.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I suppose it depends on the trade union bureaucracies. I mean, you would be forgiven for wondering if Unite was actually affiliated to Labour the way it's been organising its workers. There's been very, very little media coverage that I've seen of Sharon Graham ever mentioning Sir Keir Starmer or the Labour Party in general. I think Sharon's change of emphasis towards the members is quite refreshing. Yeah. But she's a bit of an outlier, because a lot of the other Labour affiliated unions are steadfast in their view. They're going to remain affiliated to the Labour Party, despite the fact that we have seen absolutely nothing in the last 2 years since Sir Keir Starmer was elected as leader that would suggest that he would act in the best interests of the working class. I believe that the Labour Party believes that the working class is something you pull from a drawer come election time. You claim that you act in their best interest, and when you get your election defeat or win, you put them back in the drawer and forget all about them. So yes, there are, and I think it needs to be said that I believe that there's a strong dichotomy between the membership of trade unions and their bureaucracies. I think bureaucracies are very much tied to Labour, and one of the reasons is because there is a there's an osmosis between the Labour bureaucracies and the trade union bureaucracies, where people move between the two. Yeah. Be it as
a revolving door.
Yeah. Trade union officials becoming MPs, trade union officials becoming councillors, and then Labour paid members of staff moving back into the trade union movement in well paid, you know, well expensed jobs. And of course, why would they cut that tie? Well, why would they stop that? I mean, if you're thinking from a general secretary's point of view, as an employer, effectively, employee manager, you have this rich vein of Labour minded people just sitting there that can come over to you and do things like communications work and media work and social media work and so on, things like that. So that's why they maintain that link. They always come out with all this garbage about it being influence. Oh, we can influence them, we can do this, we can do that. But the fact of the matter is, it's more to do with patronage between the two entities than it is about influence. I have questioned for many years the actual influence that trade unions have, especially the smaller trade unions. I mean, you would understand Unite having a sizable amount of influence. If you look at the money they gave to Labour during the Corbyn years, they were at the top table in terms of influence. And I'm sure there were people, and I know there were people connected to Jeremy Corbyn who were very much involved in Unite as well. But when you look at the smaller unions, you have to ask yourself, well, you're paying subscriptions, you're sending delegates to annual conference, but what influence do you really have?
What are they getting for that?
Really, exactly. And I do think, and have thought for some time, that the Labour Party's, or the trade unions' affiliation to the Labour Party is a handbrake. It's a handbrake on trade unions. It's a handbrake on the working class in general. We have examples of in the trade union movement of trade unions that were affiliated to Labour and aren't anymore. The RMT is the one that comes to mind, who politically are completely unfettered. They're able to go with whoever they like, back whoever they like, as long as they back their policies. And that's the sort of freedom I think all trade unions should be looking for.
Yeah, no, absolutely agree. And I guess we've touched a bit on Unite there. Sharon Graham, she has been saying all the right things. They've been leading the bin workers strike up in Coventry against a Labour council. How do you see this kind of playing out? Is she the real deal? What are those words translating into in terms of action?
Well, I would say that I'm very encouraged so far by what Sharon's been doing. She's been willing to be on the front line in places like Coventry for the bin workers and elsewhere. Obviously, there were bus disputes up in Manchester and in Liverpool and other places too. So that's welcome. I think for me, it needs to continue before I'm going to say she is the real deal. I also think she needs to put her money where her mouth is with regard to the Labour Party. I think she needs to lead a movement from within Unite to disaffiliate Unite from the Labour Party, and show the members that Unite is serious about cutting its ties with a party that basically despises its members. It despises the people that Unite organise. It despises workers agitating for better terms, better conditions, and better livelihoods. And until Unite, who for years had been by a mile the biggest backer of Labour, unless they cut the ties, not make threats, not make little cuts to affiliations here and there, but actually cut their ties, for me, the jury will still be out on Sharon Graham.
No, I agree. It was interesting to see in the news, though, that the police have raided the Unite headquarters in London, which seems, quite interesting timing. I don't know whether you've read much about, what's happened with the Unite headquarters and the reason for this police raid, but it's...
The only thing I've been able to gather, I mean, there was always a sort of simmering in the background issue regarding a conference and hotel that Unite was investing in Birmingham, because Unite's a very big union. It came from an amalgamation of the Transport and General Workers Union and Amicus, and the Transport and General Workers Union at the time owned a great deal of real estate. So one example, they own a hotel on the seafront in Eastbourne that they use that has conferencing facilities, and in fact I know unions have used it for their own annual conferences. But that's before you look at their big head office in Holborn. They've got head offices in places like Manchester and elsewhere. So they have a great deal of real estate. Now, they were looking to invest in a property. I don't know whether they were building it from scratch or they were redeveloping one that already existed, but it's got into huge cost overruns and has gone way, way beyond its expected opening time. And as often happens in the trade union movement, caused all sorts of conspiracy theories about who's trousering the money, or is anyone trousering the money, or what's happened. Even though anyone who's got any idea of British civil engineering projects knows that everything runs late and it always goes over budget. But no, that's the way we are. But the long and short of it, the timing seems suspicious. And if anyone's got even a modicum of suspicion about this sort of thing, we'll think, well, don't you think it's strange that Unite, who's in the front line fighting employers all over the place for the Coventry bin men, the bus workers, elsewhere, you can't go on Twitter without seeing something pop up from Unite and their latest action, then all of a sudden their offices are raided. The timing is interesting. I mean, there may be, and we don't know because the details are somewhat sketchy at the moment, there may have been a legitimate reason for the raid to take place. But the timing is extremely interesting.
And I guess, you know, as workers do look to take more action and improve their conditions, we should expect that the police will come down hard and that the ruling class will really use whatever mechanisms it has in hand to halt, you know, halt class unity really and workers' unity in their fight against the bosses. So I guess we'll have to stay tuned and hopefully, you know, we'll have more information on that. Not that you can trust anything that sort of comes out in the media about these things anyway. I know you briefly touched on, you know, the importance of unions disaffiliating from the Labour Party. And I know ASLEF in May are having their conference where they're going to be voting on this matter. Can you just sort of briefly sum up like the significance that this might have for the working class, you know, and for the Labour Party as well?
Well, ASLEF are quite a small union in terms of membership. They number around about the 18,000. But they are an incredibly industrially powerful union because they organise train drivers. When you look at not only passenger traffic that they help to carry, but also freight that they carry, they are people that do and have shown in the past, as they have shown in the past, they do have their hands on the levers of economic power. So they're a very powerful trade union. The vote in May to disaffiliate is very interesting. To those that aren't aware, it's not quite as simple as putting a motion in saying we disaffiliate from the Labour Party. If only it was that simple, because I'm sure it would have happened by now. The problem is that the link between trade unions and the Labour Party are baked into the cake in that they're written into the rules of the rule book. So in order to disaffiliate, you have to extricate all the rules that affiliate the union to the Labour Party and then call for those to be amended. So it is quite complicated and you need to know your rule book and you need to know your way around motions to do it. But ASLEF are doing it. They're talking about it next month. Now, it would be very, very significant because I think it's fair to say ASLEF, despite its quite modest size, is a quite well-known high-profile trade union. They've been involved in actions in the past, industrial action in the past. So I think they're not a union that is not unfamiliar to people. So ASLEF becoming disaffiliated from the Labour Party would make news. It would make news, most certainly. I dare say it might be embarrassing for some of the people at the very top of ASLEF if that link was to be broken. I obviously hope that it is broken. But going forward for workers, I mean, what I think it will do, it will in a slightly similar way to what happened with Brexit, it made at least nation states in Europe question their relationship. And if the only thing that comes out of whatever happens with ASLEF is that the other trade unions still affiliated question the relationship, that's a good step in the right direction. That's where I want things to go. You know, I'm not exactly expecting ASLEF to disaffiliate and by the end of the year they're all gone. That would be wishful thinking, but it would certainly call into question that relationship. And it's not beyond criticism. And believe me, I know there are a lot of trade union bureaucrats who believe that relationship is beyond reproach, that it cannot be criticised, it cannot be challenged, it cannot be questioned under any circumstance.
It's just the way that things are, and that's
it's just the way that things are. And despite all the evidence that we've seen in the last 2 years, all the evidence that we've seen, I mean, you could argue perhaps even longer than the last 2 years, where towards the end of the collapse of the Corbyn project, the evidence that we've seen suggests that Labour is no friend of working people, no friend of the working class, no friend of the trade union movement, and probably not even friends of socialism. So, with all those things,
and in fact, the biggest barrier, I would argue.
Absolutely. But... In fact, I think it's been argued that was the whole point the Labour Party was brought into being in the first place, was to stop, or at least to siphon the revolutionary instincts of the working class at the time. So, yes, I think it could be quite significant if ASLEF were to disaffiliate, yes.
Well, we'll keep our eye out for that conference in May. I guess leading on now to the trade union group within the Workers' Party, you've released a new sort of charter for change. Can you sort of talk us through this charter? I know a lot of it is about, democracy within the union movement. It's something that's obviously so important when you have such a disconnect between union membership and union leadership. Can you talk a bit about the importance of democracy in the union movement and the charter
absolutely.
as well?
One of the things that trade unions of all sizes have is what I call bureaucratic lag.
Yeah. And
by that I mean, if you have an issue in your workplace, or even an issue as an individual, the process from that issue becoming apparent to it being actually at the executive end for a decision to be made can take weeks. It can take even months, because you have to go to your branch, and then depending on the size and the structure of your union, goes from your branch possibly to a division. When it goes to a division, it might go to the executive ones. And bearing in mind, executives of some trade unions only meet 4 times a year. And so by the time you get to that point, by the time you've got it, if you've got it there at all, bearing in mind it could be voted down at any point in the process, by the time you've got it to the executive, the actual issue that you're dealing with, it may well even have changed. It's gone. Yeah, exactly. And what we believe on the trade union group, and it's reflected in the Charter for Change, is we want a much more streamlined, easy to access as well, and the access to democracy is an important point. I was at a Workers' Party branch meeting yesterday. I was talking to one of my colleagues. He's a member of Unison. I said, "Where's your branch?" He went, "I don't know." Where'd you meet? Don't know. So he doesn't know. He's been a paid up member of Unison for some time and doesn't know where his branch meets or even what it's called. He doesn't even know who to contact to find out where it is. Now, as I said to him at the time, it would be fair to say that there are a number of people within any trade union that actually have a vested interest in that happening. I have a vested interest in you not getting involved. They don't want you.
They just want to take your money, offer you some discounts on, private health insurance and holidays and car insurance, whatever. And then that's the extent of it.
That's the extent of the involvement that they want. And that's what we call the servicing trade union model. You pay a fee, you get some services, you'll get a representative if you get into trouble at work. But other than that, it's a bit like being in the AA.
Nothing proactive.
No, nothing proactive. No opportunity to get involved. No opportunity to come to a branch meeting. Not even an opportunity to go on a Zoom meeting or a WhatsApp group or something to talk to other people in similar situations to yourself. And what we're trying to do, we're trying to take steps to, and it's point 4 of our charter, to reopen, reinvigorate, and streamline the democratic structures. Because the truth is, the democratic structures of trade unions have not changed in over 100 years. They are exactly as they were at the turn of the 20th century. So when you going back to what I said at the very beginning, you had people in places of work. Branches for unions would be in those places of work. So where people were commonly paid by the week, they would often meet on the payday. They'd meet in a social club or a pub, and workers would have a few beers and talk about work. And that would be the branch meeting. Now you've got a different situation. A lot of people are salaried, they're paid on the monthly. We don't have...
They're working from home, there's no social aspect to it.
We have a much more atomized workforce. We don't have these big socialized places of work like we used to. And we find ourselves in a position where, and I think this is true in big unions and small unions, I think the branch structures kind of slightly run away from the unions. I don't even think they can keep track on all the branches they have, where they meet, where. And so that's why we're trying to find ways to reinvigorate, so that workers at the very basic level at least know what their branch is, where it meets, when it meets, and how to get there, and then they can become involved. Once we start there, I still think we need to look at things like electronic ballots for internal elections and things like that. And I think we should be looking at, I don't think Zoom is the be all and end all, or Teams or any of these other things, but they still need to be looked at, especially when you look at some of the geographical areas that some branches cover. I think of a branch that's familiar to me in a trade union where the catchment area is Devon and Cornwall. I mean, that's massive. That's a huge, I mean, you could drive
for 4 hours and
exactly. Yeah, we're talking about a huge area. If you were to use public transport, you might be able to go one way but not go home in the evening.
Yeah.
So it's those sort of things that trade unions really need to look at. I understand. I mean, the thing about I've got to be honest, the thing about the branch structure is the reason why it's still there 120 years on is because the unions have not found a better way of doing things. If you take Nautilus, for example, Nautilus is a seafarers union, they don't have branches, but that's because half their members are at sea.
Yeah.
So there's no point having branches, especially not ones on land anyway.
Yeah.
So
I guess the lack of union density and the small membership in the union movement is also like a barrier to sort of organizing smaller, more local geographical branches, because, you know, there's just not that many people, especially within your industry, within your union, who are going to be around you, unless you're in, you know, Unite or one of these big public sector unions.
Yeah, and that's how the situation I just described about this branch covering Devon and Cornwall manifests itself. The membership dwindles, the areas that they cover dwindle as well, and you end up trying to, you think, oh yeah, well, we'll make one big branch for Devon and Cornwall, but then you've almost signed its death warrant, because very few people in that branch could find one place they could all agree on to meet in.
Yeah.
Because the geographic area is huge. It's massive, and that branch will eventually die. It will wither on the vine and die. And it's that sort of thing that we're trying to overcome. I mean, I think there's a case, especially in smaller unions, to abolish the branch structure entirely. Abolish the branch structure and find ways to get members involved at as local a level as possible, without the need for them to travel many, many miles, sometimes overnight, just to go to a branch meeting.
Yeah. And I mean, if they're also traveling that far to a branch meeting, and then, you know, what are they getting out of this? If they're raising their concerns, if they're wanting to take sort of industrial action, and then they're rebuffed by their leadership, well, you know, it's just going to demoralize them, and then they'll think, why bother? And then they won't attend any more branch meetings either.
Exactly. I mean, that's the other facet of the way branch unions are structured. They can be quite demoralizing, especially for new people. I mean, old hands like me, I know how slow, how glacial it can be to get things done. But if you're a new person who doesn't understand how trade unions work, if you imagine, thanks for this, we might raise it at the branch meeting in 7 weeks' time, and then we have to then put it through to the next level, be it the sectoral level or the regional level, but their meeting's not until 3 months' time and so on. You must think, well, why does it have to take this long?
Yeah.
Why does it have to take this long? Why are there so many steps?
Yeah.
If what the worker is raising is a just issue, that should be all that matters, not the bureaucratic steps between that and getting anything done. Yeah.
I mean, especially in today's sort of information age, young people especially, we're not used to sort of waiting months for things to be heard. Everything is instantaneous now.
Yeah.
And when you have full-time, you know, paid union staff, they should be, you know, there and available, you know, as and when you need, really.
Absolutely.
Especially if you're the one who's working full-time, and then, you know, raising these things outside of your day job time.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Can you talk us through a few of the other points of the charter? I know one of them is, you know, elections for officials.
Yes. So the obviously it depends on the union. Some unions are more openly democratic in terms of their member-facing positions. And what we mean by member-facing positions, obviously the General Secretary has to go through an election. Assistant General Secretaries don't. So some unions elect their General Secretaries, some appoint them.
Yeah.
And then when you go down towards things like regional organisers, senior organisers, they're the people that actually deal with reps, deal with industrial action and so on at the ground level. Some are appointed by some unions and some are elected by some unions. Now, we believe that and I do understand the arguments for election and for appointment.
Yeah.
But what we are saying is that if you appoint someone, they do not become democratically accountable. They become a member of staff. They're a hired hand, and the only person really that can do anything about that person's performance is their line manager.
Yeah.
Whereas if they're democratically
elected, to the membership.
They're accountable to the membership. Absolutely. And part of the Charter for Change is to allow members to recall poorly performing officials. So what we're saying is member-facing officials of trade unions should be elected.
Yeah.
And that gives them the democratic accountability they need. We're not necessarily people talking about people working in the finance department, working in the membership department, admin roles. We're not talking about electing them. That's they're specialised.
They're not political roles. Yeah.
No, absolutely. But any member faces. So we're talking about political officers, general secretaries, assistant general secretaries, regional organisers, and so on. We want them to be democratically accountable, and by doing that, it allows workers to have the right to recall poorly performing organisers or other member-facing members of unions. So we want to give members the right, and this sort of tags on from what we were talking about this bureaucratic lag. We want to give members the right and means to hold secure, secret, electronic referenda on issues that affect them.
Yeah.
The reason why we've come up with this is because we've seen, as much as we've seen activity in the trade union movement, particularly in Unite, we've also seen instances where trade unions have worked against trade union action, or they've worked against worker action. So they've suppressed issues in workplaces where the workers have a legitimate right to take industrial action, and the union's response has been to try to suppress it, to calm it, and to stop it from happening. Now, what we want members to be given the right to hold a secret ballot amongst themselves, and the result of that to be binding on that trade union. So if a group of workers say, look, we have a problem with our pay, we have a problem with the conditions, we have a problem with our environment. You know, if you look at places like Amazon fulfillment sectors and some of the conditions that they work under, they would be quite entitled to say we have problems with this. So once they've made that ballot, we believe that union should then be compelled to take action. Yeah. At the moment, they're not. At the moment, they can say, well, you know, the trade union laws say that we can't do this. What we want workers to be able to say, this is our problem. We've voted on it. We are in agreement. This is what we want to do. Now you do it.
Sounds pretty straightforward.
It should do.
If a union is there to represent its members, well, then what the members say should be binding on the union.
Absolutely. The one other point, and it ties in with to a degree with the elected officials point earlier on, to give members the right to scrutinise and determine the salary and expenses of their officials. Now, this is not the politics of envy. We're not talking about necessarily taking away money from hardworking but well remunerated officials. We're talking about scrutiny. We're talking about having
where are our dues going, and what are
absolutely they? Yeah, absolutely. And it ties in again with this accountability. If you believe that a very handsomely remunerated assistant general secretary who you next to never see is worth that money, you should be able to challenge their salary. And if you don't want to challenge their salary, at least challenge their position. Yeah. And have them either recalled or deselected the next time the election comes round. But I think transparency is very, very important. It's very important in trade unions, and it is something that in some cases, and there have been quite high-profile cases lately, show that trade unions are not as transparent as they could be. Yeah. The other point we've got on our plan is to defend and promote the right of trade union members to freely associate with any political organisation they choose. Now, speaking as a trade unionist of 30 odd years, I know that there are trade unions that expect as a prime requisite to become part of the paid staff that you're a member of the Labour Party, for instance. I know of people who've become members of executive committees who felt pressure to join the Labour Party once they were elected to it, even though their political persuasions were a million miles away from the Labour Party. And we want to get away from that. Sorry, we don't want anyone in the trade union movement to feel pressure to join the Labour Party or any other party for that matter. Yeah. And we believe that the right of individual trade union members at whatever stage of the bureaucratic structure they want to go to, they don't need to be hamstrung by being asked to join trade unions or to join political parties to which they have no affiliation. And so we want people to be able to freely associate with any political party that they choose. Yeah. Another point is to found a member-led and ongoing campaign to repeal all the anti-trade union laws. Now, the anti-trade union laws have been in existence more or less now for 30 years as a block. They were added to a few years ago with the Trade Union Act, but they essentially have remained unchanged for something in the region of 30 years. and we are calling for a concerted campaign from all trade unions to abolish those anti-trade union laws.
Is there any such campaign within existing trade unions at the moment that are fighting back against these anti-trade union laws, or have they kind of just accepted them?
Well, I think it's fair to say that if you were to ask any trade union what their policy was, they would say they would be against all anti-trade union laws.
Yeah.
But what action follows from that? Yeah. I mean, again,
easy to say you're against something, but you know, are you actually mobilising against it?
Yeah. Exactly. But again, it goes back to this connection with the Labour Party for so many unions. Oh, we lobby the Labour Party. Yeah, but the Labour Party haven't had. I mean, obviously there was during the Corbyn era. There was, I think it was in the 2017 manifesto about repealing some of the anti-trade union laws, but there was nothing before the Corbyn period. There will be nothing after, because Starmer is in the pocket of the establishment. He's not in the pocket of the workers.
Yeah.
And
and also the Labour Party aren't in power, so
and they're not in power, so they can have any policy they like. Exactly. Yeah. You know, and so trade unions, and this is a fundamental point. The trade unions need to understand that if they don't do it, no one else will.
Yeah.
No one else will work on their behalf,
be
it the Labour Party or anyone else, to repeal the anti-trade union laws. The ball is in their court. It's for them to mount a concerted campaign to attack, or if need be, ignore these anti-trade union laws.
Yeah.
We're also talking about introducing an ongoing member-led accountable campaign to recruit new members on a principle that no worker should be without a trade union. Now, this is an important point. I did an interview with Paul Embry a while back.
Yeah.
And the point I made to him during that interview was it seemed extraordinary in this day and age, where you have a union for musicians, you have a union for train drivers, and a union for firefighters, and yet there was this huge tranche of workers that had to start their own trade union in order to get or to work on their behalf to improve their pay, their conditions, and so on. And I think the problem in the trade union movement has been that for far too long, they've set their own borders. Yeah. They've worked in silos to a degree, and they're not prepared and haven't been prepared to expand into areas where they know there is a sizable number of unorganized workers.
Yeah.
And what this point is about is to push every single trade union to go on recruitment campaigns. And I understand that obviously ASLEF's a good example. They organise train operators or train drivers. So there's no point in them organising care workers necessarily. But it's about making sure that all trade unions within the boundaries of their rules have almost 100% membership in every sector and every organisation and every industry.
Well, it goes back to what we were saying before about the branch structure has basically been unchanged in 100 years. But, you know, think about how different the world of work is to 100 years ago. You know, the industries that existed that were dominant 100 years ago are completely different to what they are now. I mean, I know that there's been the, is it the IWGB that's sort of been set up to capture these, you know, Uber delivery drivers and that kind of thing. You know, these guys could have been brought into other existing trade unions and strengthened the membership base of those, but they've gone and created their own. I think they're doing some great work, but there has to be these little pockets or industries of workers that are popping up that are not really covered by any of these traditional sort of structures.
Yeah, absolutely. And the establishment of unions like United Voices of the World and the Independent Workers of Great Britain should sound a warning to the trade union movement. That workers, when forced to, will organise themselves. They don't necessarily need a trade union, or they will start their own. Yeah, it's very difficult. Don't get me wrong. I think the history of the trade union movement in this country in the last 80 years, there's only been 2 unions started from scratch. There's been lots of amalgamations and mergers, but there's only been 2 started from scratch. But if workers are forced into doing it, they will do it. Yeah. And it's all very well trade unions looking on while transient workers like the IWGB and the United Voices of the World organised, while they organised themselves, but they were members that other unions could have recruited and chose not to. So we really do need. I mean, I think as well, and part of the, or certainly one of my personal views is that we need to make it much easier for people to start their own trade unions. I mean, one of my personal wishes, if I was king for a day, I would introduce a law that allowed any 5 workers in a workplace to be a trade union.
Yep.
And for the employer to be legally obliged to recognise them as a trade union.
Yeah.
And the reason why I believe that would be a good thing for workers is, imagine what the trade unions, the existing established trade unions, how they would act if they knew there were 5 people away from having a rival union competing in their space, in their with the employers that they were recognised by.
Yeah.
It would certainly make them up their game, in my view. The last point I wanted to go over on the Charter for Change is to support an inquiry into blacklisting, encompassing victims of blacklisting in the past, and to investigate blacklisting now and in the future. I mean, anyone who's read anything about blacklisting, particularly in things like the construction industry, could only be shocked by what employers, and it has to be said, some trade unions did, to prevent workers raising legitimate safety concerns, and how they were punished with basically being put in a position where they couldn't work. We've never had a full open inquiry into that. I dare say there are certain trade unions who would rather that didn't happen, because there was collusion on the part of some trade unions. But I think it really does need to happen. And I think, as a small addendum to that final point, we need to have a similar inquiry into people who were blacklisted for things like whistleblowing. Whistleblowing is an important and integral part of maintaining safety and integrity in the workplace. And I think people should never be punished for calling out things that are wrong in their workplaces. And we should support those people as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's nothing in there that I can argue with. I'd like to hear, any responses from trade union officials, what issue they would have with this program for change, because, it all seems like basic common sense to me. For trade unions, if they want to represent their members, then they should be open to being more open and being more democratic and being more accountable to their members, especially at a time where we're going through unprecedented economic crisis, unprecedented attacks on the working class, on our living and working conditions. Unions should really be at the forefront of leading the response to these assaults, and they're all kind of a bit quiet for my liking. But I did lastly just want to touch on, there's a kind of political split happening within the trade union movement. I couldn't say how long this has been going on, but I've noticed with unions like the UCU going down this sort of identity politics route, and basically blaming Kathleen Stock, the academic in Sussex who quit her job because she was facing attacks from death threats and these kind of things from students because of her feminist views, really. And then you have, RMT, which have kind of avoided this question and not really gone down that sort of way. I mean, what does this mean for workers? I guess the UCU is, representing universities, so it's going to be more prone to falling into this IDPOL sort of, I don't know, just going down that sort of rabbit hole. But, what's the danger in these kinds of political ideologies infecting the union movement?
Well, in simple terms, it's a complete lack of class consciousness on the part of the trade union movement. Anyone who was around in the 1970s and the 1980s, when working class resistance was at last at its peak, I think it'd be fair to say, would tell you that most people who organised workers in their workplaces didn't care whether you were a woman or a man, whether you were gay or you were straight, black, white, or whatever religion you were. If you worked in the same place as I did, you were the same as I was. That was it.
And we all have a shared interest, and
we all have a shared
and
interest.
Our power comes from us being together.
We have a shared interest, and we have a common enemy. And it's that sort of attitude that's been largely lost in the trade union movement, because identity politics is taking the working class and splitting them up into little boxes, and putting each person into one of those little boxes, and never the twain shall meet. And it's really, really destructive. If we're going to walk right, if we go back to fundamental principles, the fundamental principle of a trade union is to build working class power. It cannot build working class power if you've taken the working class and split them up along race, sex, religion, and any other line you care to mention, and keep everyone apart from each other and do nothing to build unity amongst them. Unfortunately, we've got a, and my personal experience of this is that I think and it goes back to one of my original points about employing member-facing positions, where you've got someone who comes in as an organizer, who comes from university, that, as you said, is prone to this id pol nonsense. Then that id pol attitude they bring into the trade union, and it pervades everything that they do. Whereas, in my view, if you were to recruit organisers from actual workplaces, from actual reps, where id pol, frankly, has not permeated as much as it has in other places, in universities and so on, then that person's attitude is about building working class power and maintaining class consciousness, and that's exactly what trade unions should be doing. This id pol, as you say, is a rabbit hole. I believe that in general terms, identity politics is the politics of working to achieve nothing. I don't see any material gain that could be given to people through the use of identity politics.
Well, it's just total individual liberalism, really, and it doesn't serve workers at all.
It's liberalism manifest. It's absolutely nothing to do with socialism. It's nothing to do with building working class power, and bluntly, it's nothing to do with trade unionism. And I think it's important that people who do have influence inside trade unions use that influence to push back against identity politics, because it's certainly not going to, in my view, improve the lot of working people.
Well, I mean, I guess it's this question of whether, those who are part of this revolving door between the union movement and the Labour Party, whether they're actually there to, defend the conditions of their workers, or whether they're there to just get a job within the Labour Party, which is also down this id pol rabbit hole. So, maybe they're using it as a way to audition for a job in the for an MP
I think
role.
You make a good point. I think you make a good point. I think I would say to someone who maintained a strong level of class consciousness and got involved in the trade union movement, well, you can, if you wanted to get a gig in Labour, you'd have to kiss it goodbye if you're going to go down that road, because they're not interested in people that want to build working class power. They're not even interested in the working class. So I think if you had any aspirations in that direction, you could probably kiss them goodbye.
And finally, we have a lot of trade union members within the Workers' Party, but we're also wanting to attract trade union activists who are maybe looking for a party to join and want to freely associate, of course, with the Workers' Party. What sort of practical things can you suggest for people to do if they want to learn more about the work that the TU group within the Workers' Party is doing, and how they can look at your charter and maybe try and take this to their workplace, take it to their union?
Okay, so we're doing a number of things. The first thing that someone can do is obviously join the Workers' Party of Britain. But obviously beyond that, what they could do is reach out to the Workers' Party, become more involved in the trade union group. We meet every month, and we discuss all things current and more general in terms of the trade union movement. Regarding the Charter for Change, I'm looking to run 2 introduction to trade union courses at the end of this month. It'll be an online course, so it'll be a Zoom course with me going through a PowerPoint presentation. So to people who are members of the party and people who are interested in becoming a member of the party who aren't familiar with trade unions, and as I said earlier on, there's about 24 million people who aren't familiar with trade unions because they don't organise in the places that they work. But if they want to become more interested and more involved in trade unions, I'm running this course. I'll do one in the week, one evening, and I'll do one at the weekend for people. And then beyond that, we're looking to hold a fringe meeting later in the year. Someone actually suggested a TUC conference, which will be very, very interesting, where we will invite anyone of any persuasion who's a trade union member to come along, look at our very sensible 10-point plan, and hopefully get people more involved in trade unions. And the whole principle of this Charter for Change is for Workers' Party trade union members to take these 10 points into their branch meetings, into their sectoral meetings, their regional meetings, their executive committee meetings, or whatever it is that they do, and try and affect real change for the benefit of working class people. So that's what they can do.
Oh, great. Sounds interesting, because I've recently become a member of Unite myself, but yeah, I mean, similar to your local branch member in the Workers' Party, I don't know where my branch is. I don't know who to contact. I don't know any of these things. No. So it's definitely reminded me that I need to look into that.
Absolutely. Well, if anyone else who's watching has joined a union and doesn't have a clue where they meet, you're not alone. But if you reach out to us, we'll do our best to try and find out for you where the branches meet and where you can get along.
Yeah. And is there a trade union group email address, or how can people get in contact if they're a Workers' Party member who want to know more?
The best address I would say would be mine. It's all one word, Jason Turvey, WPB.
Yeah.
@gmail.com.
Okay, well, we'll put that in the description box below so people can have a look. But thank you so much for joining me this morning. I've certainly learned a lot. Someone who I'm not really that knowledgeable about trade unions, but it's always good to understand the history, to know how we got to this point, and to think about how we can change it and make it better. So yeah, thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to the course and the other union group meetings that you have coming up. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Good to talk.
Take care. Cheers.